Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Dividock. I'm the supervisor for the Planning, Zoning, and Land Use Unit within Oakland County, the Planning and Local Business Development Division here in Oakland County. Welcome to today's virtual planners gathering, Oakland County's Materials Management Plan. Just a few reminders, the meeting's recorded and will be made available on our website. And if you have any questions, use the chat function in Zoom. And send your questions to Jim Schaefer. He'll moderate a question and answer session after the presentations have completed. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Whitney Calio. She's a principal planner here in the Planning and Local Business Development Division. Whitney, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Ryan, and thank you to all of you on the call for joining in today to learn a little bit more about our materials management plan. Probably you've been hearing about this throughout the county, so hopefully after today you'll have a little better understanding of what the plan entails, where it's been, where it's going, and how we plan to get there. So what is materials management? Materials management system is really an approach to using and reusing materials more productively over their life cycles, determining the highest and best use for materials, including all sorts of recyclables, wood, tires, textiles, concrete, just a lot of the materials that generally get thrown away. Here's a simplified graphic of basically what materials management is. So currently, for the most part, recycle bins are small and our trash cans are large. So really materials management is aiming to flip that so that we're really utilizing more of what we're throwing out than what we're actually throwing into our trash to end up in a landfill. Some benefits of this, I think, are to reduce our environmental impacts, identifying alternatives to landfilling. So in that effect, we'll be preserving our landfill space and then contributing to a circular economy. So what is the circular economy? This is a model of production and consumption, including sharing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, recycling materials and products as long as we can to extend their life cycle. So you can see the graphic here lists the linear economy, where we take resources, we make a product with those, we use the product, and then once the product is no longer usable, it's waste. The packaging may be waste. But if you look at the circular economy, we take those same resources, we make a product, we use the product, but then we reuse it, we can repair it, we recycle it, and return it back to use. So you get a circular economy so that, again, we're throwing away less trash and really extending the life cycle of all of these products that we produce. So this plan is being overseen by the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, known as EGLE. And this is the materials management hierarchy that has been created through EGLE. So at the very top of our preferred list of how we'd like to handle things is to just reduce them. The toxicity of the materials as well as just the materials themselves, reducing what we're taking. Reusing them is the next option. So I guess an example of that might be grocery bags, the reusable grocery bags at the store. You're giving things to a nonprofit organization so they can be redistributed within the community. So really focusing on reusing products and then repurposing them, upcycling them into a different purpose. An example of this might be taking old pallets and making planter boxes or something with the wood from those pallets. There are a lot of different products that can be upcycled for a different purpose. Recycling, which we're making new products out of the old products. Recovering the waste to create energy. And then last but not least, our last resort is landfilling the product. So you might wonder why we're preparing a materials management plan and why this is happening now. There were updates to Michigan's Public Act 451, which is the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act, Part 115. These updates were approved by the Michigan legislature in late 2022 and went into effect in March of 2023. As part of those updates, on January 8th of this year, the director of EGLE initiated the process for each county in Michigan to prepare a materials management plan under those amendments. The new plan will replace our existing county solid waste plan, and it will prepare for a transition to this new materials management system of handling materials rather than a disposal focus. So this is a picture of the existing solid waste management plan for the county. This was written in the late 90s. As you can see, it was approved in the early 2000s, so it's been around for a long time and really needed an update. The main focus of the solid waste plans were to ensure that there was enough landfill disposal capacity in the region for all of the waste that was generated in the county. There are other elements to the plan, but that was a big focus of those plans. The last, and to my knowledge, the only amendment to this plan took place in 2014, and that was to site a new transfer station in one of the municipalities. There was a solid waste planning committee that helped in writing the solid waste plan back in the 90s, but that committee has been officially dissolved by our Board of Commissioners now. That happened just a few months ago. This plan does remain in effect until the new materials management plan has been approved by EGLE. So some of the administrative actions that have been taking place, there's been a lot going on that we've had to do in-house, just kind of getting ready for us to undertake this whole planning process. So one of those, and probably a very important aspect of it, was that we have identified the county approval agency, which is the entity that will assume the responsibility for the plan and is authorized to approve the plan. So that has been identified as the Board of Commissioners. And the Board of Commissioners, the CAA, has appointed the designated planning agency, which is the governmental entity that will develop and administer the plan. EGLE refers to this as the worker bees who will actually be working on getting the plan developed. And so the DPA for the county is the Office of the Oakland County Executive. The CAA identified a specific individual to be the DPA representative. That role has come down to me. I'm a principal planner in the Department of Economic Development in the Planning and Local Business Development Division. So I'll be the main representative, working with a lot of others in our division and actually within other county departments as needed as we're working on the plan. The Board of Commissioners has interviewed and seated a new committee, which is the Materials Management Planning Committee, an 11-member committee. And we were able to find individuals to fill all of those slots. The makeup of that committee is specified in the law, what sectors they need to represent. So we have an elected official from the county, from ours is a city, it could be a city or village, a township, also a SEMCOG representative, an operator of a business that generates a managed material, an environmental interest group representative, a solid waste disposal facility operator, a waste hauler, a material recovery facility operator, which is where the recyclables go, a composting or anaerobic digester facility operator, and a waste diversion, reuse, or reduction facility operator. So as I mentioned, we were able to fill all of those slots. We did have quite a bit of interest in the committee, had a lot of good candidates apply. So some of the responsibilities, which are written into the law that the committee will have during this process, are to direct the DPA in the preparation of the plan, review and approve the work program, which is kind of the outline of how we're going to work on this plan. Identify relevant local policies and priorities, ensure coordination in the preparation of the plan, advise the county and municipalities regarding the plan, ensure that we as the DPA are fulfilling all of the requirements of Part 115, including but not limited to the plan's content and also the public participation piece of the plan. Notify the DPA and all applicable parties of any deficiencies in the plan or the process, anything that we're missing that we should be focusing on. They're responsible for approving the plan prior to the public comment period. And they provide the final level of plan approval before the plan goes to the CAA, which once again is the Board of Commissioners for approval. So additional administrative tasks, as part of the requirements, we had to consult with all of the adjacent counties to determine whether we would work together to submit a multi-county plan or whether we would submit a single county plan. Oakland County has decided that we will submit our own single county plan, but we will continue to work with other Southeast Michigan counties where it's appropriate. We've been actually sharing a lot of ideas and thoughts as this process has gone on thus far. To my knowledge, Lapeer County is the only adjacent county that's engaging in a multi-county plan, and they're working with some counties to their north, more in the thumb region, but all of the other counties are preparing their own single county plan. We've created a materials management work program. So this is something that's required to be approved by the Materials Management Planning Committee. So we have a meeting with them next week, and we're hoping that that plan will be approved at that meeting. Again, this is kind of an outline of the steps we need to take, what we've already done, just kind of laying out where we're going and how we get to the end goal of creating this plan. So we're hoping that will be approved next week, and then it would go on to the Board of Commissioners to review and approve towards the end of October. And then we are required to submit this work program to EGLE. We're hoping to do that in late October. We do have a deadline, which was triggered by other steps that we've taken in the plan. We had 180 days from that time to get this plan to EGLE for approval. And so our deadline is December 9th. So we are hoping to get that to them with plenty of time for them to review and be able to approve the work program. We do plan to put out an RFP to have a consultant assist with the development of the plan. We're currently working on the scope of work for that RFP. We'll continue to do so until the end of the year. And we're hoping and planning that early next year is when we'll be able to issue the RFP. Again, that's tentative, but that's our current plan. So hopefully we'll have a consultant on board in the first few months of next year. And then we will be applying for a materials management planning grant as soon as the application and the grant agreement are available from EGLE. So the materials management planning grant will be available to all counties after the work program that they develop is approved by EGLE. It's not a competitive grant. It's available to all counties. We would receive $60,000 per year. And then during the first 3 years, while we're developing the plan, we'll receive an additional 50 cents per capita up to $300,000. So Oakland County will be receiving $360,000 for each of the 3 years to develop the plan and also for implementation of the plan, whatever that might look like. And for years 2 and 3 and beyond, we have to continue to show that we're making progress towards completing the plan and towards meeting our goals that we set forth in the plan to receive the funds each year. So here are some milestones that have happened with our materials management plan so far. As I mentioned, the EGLE director called for the counties to initiate the process on January 8th of this year. That triggered a 6-month period where we had to file a notice of intent with EGLE, letting them know that we were undertaking the plan. The Oakland County Board of Commissioners filed that notice on June 12th of this year, and then appointed the Materials Management Planning Committee soon after that. We held our first Materials Management Planning Committee meeting on August 27th. That meeting was very administrative in nature, introductions, adopting bylaws, electing a chair and vice chair. So that was a good meeting. And then that June 12th filing of the notice of intent triggered a 36-month period that we have to complete the materials management plan for the county. So that will be due in June of 2027. So these are some slides. I think they came from EGLE, just a high overview of aspects of the plan. It will have an inventory of the materials management facilities and the available capacity in the region. New regulations on recycling, compost, and diversion facilities, and that they must be consistent with our plan. We'll be establishing a current municipal solid waste recycling rate. We will have to set goals of where we want to go, so we need to know where we are at this point in time. We'll identify current materials management utilization capacity and what more will be needed. And then we'll establish county goals and objectives, documenting all organic and inorganic diversion practices. And we have to have a plan also to meet benchmark recycling standards. So these are the benchmark recycling standards that are written into the law. So there needs to be curbside recycling in communities over 5,000 by 2026. This can be via a municipal contract. This can be via individual subscription by the homeowner with their waste hauler. Convenient drop-offs for rural and urban counties by 2032. And then counties under 100,000, at least one drop-off for every 10,000 residents. But of course, we're in the county over 100,000 population. So at least one drop-off for every 50,000 residents. A few more elements of the plan are that we'll have enforceable mechanisms to achieve our goals and assign responsibility for the implementation of the plan. Ensure that new facilities can be sited and developed. Local zoning and host community approval approach is certainly preferred. Preemption if required. And non-exclusionary zoning of needed facilities, including an overview of the transportation infrastructure for all, excuse me, for all managed materials, and implementation strategy to meet the goals. And as I said before, as we're making progress towards the goals, that's when the funding will be available during those subsequent years. So additional plan elements. We are planning to have a robust stakeholder engagement. We'll be working with our consultant and in the development of our RFP to really take a lot of feedback, a lot of information, a lot of suggestions and ideas from stakeholders throughout the county so that everyone is involved. We'll be creating projections of the population growth and materials generation for future years, including a siting process for facilities, identifying other materials management system enhancements and opportunities, and a big education and outreach plan, which I think will be very important as we're going through this and developing goals. There have been some projects that have taken place over the last couple of years as we knew this was coming down the pipe to help us kind of start preparing and gathering data for the materials management plan. The first of those was a project through EGLE in consultation with Resource Recycling Systems. This was called the Mega Data Project. And basically this was inventorying what's out there, what communities in each county are doing, what services the residents have access to, whether they're drop-offs. And so by doing that, we kind of get a small snapshot in time of where things stood at that point, identifying gaps. Clearly there were things that aren't included in there that need to be included in there, but it's a good starting point for that kind of data collection. After that, the EGLE had a materials management county engagement grant. With that grant, ours was facilitated through SEMCOG. So we worked with neighboring counties. As I mentioned earlier, we continue to work with them on this materials management plan as we're moving along. But this grant looked at the mega data project and really talked about in the region where we are, where we need to go, and also gave us an opportunity to work. Sorry, I guess I haven't moved in quite a while. Also gave us an opportunity to really form a relationship with our neighboring counties, with the people in those counties that are really going to be working on the on the materials management plan. Been extremely helpful, and even though we're done technically with this grant, we continue to meet to share our ideas. We're sharing documents that we're creating for the plan, as we're all in the same boat. It's a new process. And so it really helps to have peers that are also working through this, and we're able to share a lot of information. And SEMCOG is continuing to facilitate that group, which we're thankful for that. It's just been really beneficial in my opinion. This is an example of something that came out of some of the work that had been done. To the right, if you receive the presentation or look up the presentation later on, is the link to the EGLE map. But these are interactive maps that have been created identifying the facilities that came out of that mega data project. So you can see the one that's listed as for the transfer station in Pontiac, just gives information about it. But hopefully as we're going along, we're going to be having different facilities that will be added to this, identifying things that are missing. But this is somewhat of a useful tool. This is another tool this one was developed by EGLE, and it's a generation tool based on our population and state averages, trying to just have an idea of how much of each type of waste is generated in the county, so that when we're trying to identify what kind of capacity we might need, this is somewhere to go on. So this will be a helpful tool as we're moving along. And I think it's very interesting to look at the breakdown of what percentages are the different types of materials in the waste generated. So some of you from the different municipalities have probably been wondering why you're receiving all of these notifications about the plan. So there are a lot of requirements in the law for us to notify the municipalities. So we had to initially notify everyone when the notice of intent was prepared. So that was in June. We had to request that each municipality post the link to our website for information for any residents or businesses who might be interested in finding that information. We must notify each community at least 10 days before each public meeting at which the plan will be discussed with the Materials Management Planning Committee. And the notices were sent to the chief elected officials and any others that have requested to be notified. So for community involvement, we request that you make sure you have added the link to your website. So it's right there, oakgov.info/MMP. We sent out a survey early on to find out who from each community would like to be notified and whether you would like to be notified via USPS mail or email or both. So if you have any changes to what you submitted, or if there are others within your community or new staff that you would like to have added to our notification list, please just send that information to me and we'll get them added to the list. We currently have, I think overall, we have around 300 that are on the notification list, and about 50 of those have requested USPS mail. So for any of you who are getting that, if you've decided that you would rather just receive that information via email, then again, feel free to just let me know that. So when the meeting notices come, we request that you take a look, and if there are items on the agenda that are of interest to you, please attend the meeting. When we get to this point in the planning process, we ask for your help with promoting public engagement opportunities for residents and for businesses. Again, as we're moving along, we might be reaching out to you to ask for any materials management related facilities or services that are available in your municipality. So we probably have a lot of that, but if any that you can provide, we'd like to have as much information as possible, as complete of a picture as possible as to what's available in the county. So we could certainly use your help at the municipal level in achieving that. There will be a public review period, and we'll appreciate your review and comments on the plan as that comes about. And when we're getting towards the end of this process, we will ask that you take the approved draft plan to your city council or your township board of trustees for approval by resolution. So this is a outline of the plan development and approval process. The EGLE director initiated the plan in January, as I mentioned. We filed our notice of intent within 180 days, which ours again was in June. So now we're going to be developing the plan for quite some period of time. Once the draft plan is approved by the committee, we will have a 60-day public comment period, during which a public hearing will also take place. Then after that public comment period, the draft plan has to be revised if need be. And that needs to take place within 30 days. Once the Materials Management Planning Committee approves the plan, it is then sent to the county approval agency, which once again is the Oakland County Board of Commissioners, for approval. And once that is approved by the CAA, it's sent to all of the municipalities in the county for approval by resolution. We're required to receive 67% approval from all of the municipalities that consider the plan within 120 days. So as you can see, this approval process is going to take some time. And then at that point, we will be submitting the plan to EGLE for final approval. Okay, before I actually stop for questions, I wanted to mention in our division, we facilitate the Trail Water Land Alliance for the county. And we do have an event next week on Thursday in the village of Milford. So I just wanted, if anyone is interested in this, please contact me and we'll get you the information. But I think it's very relevant as we have a speaker from Spurt Industries, which is a compost facility in Wixom. And they're also doing some food waste composting and pilot program there. So I just thought I would put in a small plug for that if anyone is interested in that. But with that, I would entertain questions. I'll do my best to answer them. This is a very complex process and new law that we're all trying to work our way through. But again, I really appreciate you taking the time to join in today, and I guess we'll open it up for questions.
Great, Whitney. Excellent presentation. Thank you. And just a reminder for folks, if you do have questions, put them in the chat directly to me, Jim Schaefer, and we'll moderate them through. First question is, where can we find who the members of the MMP committee are and specifically their roles?
Okay, I will see if we have that on our website. If not,
Actually,
it will
I
be getting there.
I just see Kristen posted it.
Okay, good.
There's a link to, it went to me, so I'll forward it on.
Okay.
All right. I'll do that
Along with that, I would like to point out, I don't think I mentioned this, that the committee is a committee of the Board of Commissioners. So all of the agendas and the minutes and the materials shared during those meetings are on the Board of Commissioners website, where they have all of their other committee meetings and board meetings listed. So
Okay, I just
mention that.
forwarded that on to everybody, so you'll see it in the chat as a link. And thank you, Kristen.
Yep, thank you both.
All right, I don't see any other questions at the moment. If you do have, well, I see somebody's raising their hand. Go ahead, sir, Richard.
Yes, very nice presentation. Well done, well thought up. I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
I spent time at Oakland University and worked with the Oakland University Recycling Group. And one idea I was impressed, you talked about public participation, public education, outreach, and public engagement. A suggestion would be to facilitate some public tours of the recycling facility so that the citizen can actually go through, be better educated on what should I put in, what should I not put in. I have a pizza box, but it has pizza stains on it. Is that eligible or not eligible? Or wax paper or this or that or the other. And I think just that opportunity to walk through the facility, see the magnitude of the challenge we are facing. How do we handle all of this and how best to do it? So my suggestion is just to facilitate some public tours of the recycling facilities and or composting facilities. Personally, I get a lot of leaves every fall. And instead of bagging them, I compost them. And I really enjoy that. And I think composting, again, is an idea that I think it was on one of your possibilities. But if there's an opportunity for people to see how to do it and how to make it work. So keep up the good work. I'm really impressed.
All right, well, thank you for that. And that's a great suggestion. And we're looking for all those kind of suggestions as we move through this process. So we will make note of that. And I think that was a great idea. Thank you.
Okay, the next question, Whitney, is curbside pickup or drop-off locations for composting being considered, including food waste?
I would, at this point, we're not even into the content of the plan. So absolutely, that will be part of the discussion. So I guess yes, but not quite yet. We're just still kind of working on getting to the point where we're actually starting the content of the plan. Absolutely, though, and food waste is really a big item that's being discussed just all around the state at this time. So absolutely, that will be part of the discussion.
Okay. Next question. As part of this process, are there any plans to provide guidance to the municipalities as far as our solid waste contracts? And specifically, for example, if food composting becomes something we have to do based on the plan, that would represent a major change to the existing terms of contracts.
Yes, absolutely. I think having sample contracts, sample language for a lot of different purposes in those in the contracts, and even templates for different policies, or maybe not policies isn't the right word, but for different programs that different businesses might want to undertake. So I think, yes, as much of that kind of thing that we can provide in the plan, I think we will. So please, yeah. And again, if you have specific suggestions on those, please send them or engage when it's time in the stakeholder engagement, because really like to make this comprehensive and work for everyone.
Okay. Next question. The interim process requires that any proposed facilities to receive approval from the proposed facilities to receive approval from the local legislative body. Is it known if this requirement will continue after the MMP has been completed? And thank you again for all your help.
I would say that we don't know that at this point, as the plan is not written. I guess I would just leave it at that.
Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions. If anyone has them out there or typing, oh, we got another one. Does this program include working with the Oakland County Extension and Master Gardeners?
I think it will, and I think that that's great point to bring up, because again, we'll be doing outreach, and as I said, we'll be working with other groups in the county, and yeah, those people have a lot of knowledge in certain areas that we'll be looking at in this plan, so absolutely.
Okay. Next question, will the recycling programs be able to process plastics locally?
Again, I don't know that at this point. I will say that there has been a lot of work being done at the state level for the end markets for the material, and trying to increase that, identifying what's missing throughout the state. So it's possible, but I really don't have a good answer to that at this point.
Okay. Next question is, what are the terms of the board members?
That's a good question. So the initial terms are 5 years. And then there is a staggered approach, so that a few members might be appointed for 3 years, for 2 years, for 5 years. It's all written into the law, how that goes, but the initial appointment is for 5 years.
All right. And just to mention, I did include a link to the MMP page on the county's website, so folks can access that to keep updated on information as it's available, because that is an ongoing process as things evolve. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So Ryan?
Yeah, I just want to thank Whitney for joining us today, providing an excellent presentation. I also want to thank all of you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you at our next scheduled planners gathering, which will be on October 23rd. And it'll be a presentation on short-term rentals. So again, thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.